do give thanks to God for this day that He has made, that we have the privilege of enjoying and doing that together this morning. Thank you for being here. I hope that our time will be well spent and useful as we consider some things together. We are going to be considering those things together from Isaiah chapter 7, and I invite you to be opening to Isaiah chapter 7, please. There we go. In Isaiah chapter 7, we primarily will look at the first 16 verses together. We'll sort of refer to things throughout the entire chapter, but we'll be taking most of our thoughts from there this morning. Isaiah chapter 7 concerns largely a conversation had between Isaiah, the prophet of God, sent directly to do this by God, and the king, who at the time is a man named Ahaz. Now, some of the life and times of Ahaz will become apparent as we read this chapter more. Suffice to say for now, if you need to know one thing about King Ahaz, he is a wicked man. He is a bad king. He is a very sinful person. He has practiced child sacrifice, offering his own offspring through the fire to worship the false gods that Judah had acquired for themselves by this time. He has been idolatrous. He has been violent and bloodthirsty. He is a wicked and sinful king whose reign will be judged in large part by his own shortcomings and evil. But it is to him that Isaiah will be sent. I want to read this first section together. Let's begin in verse 1 of Isaiah chapter 7. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, that Rezin, king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, went up to Jerusalem to make war against it, but could not prevail against it. Now I know we just read a lot of names, so just to stop there and gain our footing for a moment, putting aside who these men are and the specifics of when this might have happened and so forth, what he's telling us there, if you're not familiar with the history at all, this is during the time when Judah and Israel were separate kingdoms. They were separate nations, north and south. Though they had begun as the 12 tribes of Israel, they were fractured by this time. And what King Ahaz of Judah is having to deal with is that his cousins to the north, Israel, have banded together with the nation of Syria to fight against him. They have both come south to come all the way to Jerusalem itself, the capital of Judah, where the palace is, where the temple is, where the king is. They have come to make war against him, and yet, so far at least, Jerusalem is holding fast. They've been able to repel their enemies. In verse 2, let's continue. And it was told to the house of David, that is a way of saying the king himself. In fact, that's the only time that name, that appellation, will be given to just a single man. But it is speaking of King Ahaz. He is described as the house of David, the king. Syria's forces are deployed in Ephraim and Israel. So his heart and the heart of his people were moved as the trees of the woods are moved with the wind. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, "Go out now to meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub, your son, at the end of the aqueduct from the upper pool on the highway to the fuller's field, and say to him, 'Take heed and be quiet. Do not fear or be faint-hearted for these two stubs of smoking firebrands, for the fierce anger of Rezin and Syria and the son of Remaliah. Because Syria, Ephraim, and the son of Remaliah have plotted evil against you, saying, Let us go up against Judah and trouble it, and let us make a gap in its wall for ourselves, and set a king over them, the son of Tabel. Thus says the Lord God, It shall not stand, nor shall it come to pass. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be broken, so that it will not be a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is Remaliah's son. If you will not believe, surely you shall not be established. Now, some things in these first 9 verses, really in the first handful of verses, help to set the foreboding mood in Jerusalem. A time of crisis, a time of uncertainty, even beyond the note that we saw there in verse 2, that the hearts of the people were quivering. Very good imagery that's used there. You picture the leaves on a tree shaking when the wind comes through. We're a little bit accustomed to that imagery in Oklahoma and Tulsa, aren't we? You see how things rustle and shake, and he's saying their hearts were that way. They're quivering in fear. They're trembling. But even beyond that, where is Isaiah to meet Ahaz? He's walking along the aqueduct. He's expecting or anticipating a siege, maybe recovering from one that had been against them, making sure that their defenses were in order, that they'll be able to have water in the city maybe when their enemies return. And so Isaiah brings along his son for this mission at the Lord's command, Shear-Jashub. And the prophets often gave names to their children, or were commanded to give names to their children that had some kind of meaning, maybe for the prophet himself, but especially to the people who were around them. Their names would be symbolic. Their names would be lessons in themselves. This particular son's name, I don't know how old the boy was at this time, but this particular son, Shear-Jashub, has a name that is a bit of a personality test. Are you a positive person or are you a negative person? Maybe you can figure out based on how you translate or how you kind of make sense of this name. His name means literally, a remnant shall return. If you were given a prophecy, if someone told you, you will recover money from the insurance company, is that good news or bad? Well, you think, okay, insurance companies can be difficult to deal with. I'm glad they're going to pay off for me, right? I'll be able to recover some money. Good news. But then you also think, but what's going to happen that I'm going to need the insurance company to pay for something? That says some disaster is coming, right? Is that good or is that bad? A remnant shall return. Well, good that we won't all be lost, but where are they returning from? And why so few? This name is, in context, maybe serving both causes. God wants faith from Ahaz. Not to obscure the point of this lesson, what we're talking about this morning will absolutely be the need for faith, and God wants it from the king in the first place. Maybe he's telling Isaiah to bring this son along, that you have given this name, a remnant shall return, to remind Ahaz that God will watch over his people. God will preserve the remnant. However, it could also be that grim reminder that Judah will eventually fall into foreign powers, not local ones. They will have to return. There will only be so many. Nevertheless, we're reminded immediately that Ahaz should not fear. They want to set a king over Judah themselves, Syria and Ephraim. They have in mind that they'll set up a puppet kingdom, but they are going against the house of David. That's how God refers to Ahaz in this case. This government has Jehovah's support, and it has since the time of David, since 2 Samuel 7. God has said, I'm establishing you. And so the prophet here makes pronouncements to the same end. I know it looks bad. They've gotten far, Syria and Israel have. They've made it to the capital. They were a big threat, but this incursion will fail. Ephraim won't survive much longer at all. Both powers will be crushed. Their kings, or their heads, is the way he describes them in verse 9. Those heads will be taken away. They're not as great a threat as they seem to be. Don't be afraid. But the need is for Ahaz to look beyond his fears to what God is revealing and actually believe this report and act accordingly. God is telling him, yes, There is nothing to fear from them. Ephraim has allied himself with Damascus or with Syria. There's no power in that beyond what human kings can offer. That seems to be the point in verses 8 and 9. Sounds a little cryptic when you read them first. The head of Syria is Damascus. The head of Damascus is Rezin. And then he goes on to talk about judgment. What's the point of that? I think it is simply to say that's where the power ends. You follow this all the way to the top. You've got a nation that is ruled by a capital city. You've got a capital that is governed by a man. But that's all there is. You reach the top of that organization and you've got one man, and I'm going to take him out of the way. He's gone. You don't need to worry about them from that point on. Within a few years, those nations will have no land to return to. Would Judah remember? If he follows that same exercise, will Ahaz remember? The head of Judah is Jerusalem. And the head of Jerusalem is the house of David. And that's me. If I act as God wanted me to act, and as my ancestor David did when God established his throne and his rule, will I follow that path, or will I follow Israel's path? So what is he told to do? Have faith, or believe in verse 9. It's translated both ways, depending on which version you're reading from. If you will not believe, if you will not have faith, you will not be established. Those two words have the same stem. They're words that are related to each other. Not the exact same word, but in their original, they are very similar to one another. God is essentially saying, if you do not stand firm in me, you will not stand firm at all. This is the only way it will happen, if you have faith in what I am telling you. Otherwise, all is lost. But beyond that, again, thinking of David, I keep referring to David and this covenant that God made with David. This is the same term that is used in that Davidic covenant. Back in 2 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 16, God said to David, your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. That made sure is the same word that we will find here. Established. God says to David, your house, your throne, your crown, your kingdom, I make sure. I establish it. And now God is telling Ahaz, if you do not believe, that won't be the case for you. It will stop. That protection, that favor that I've shown you will end if you do not believe. I like very much what Brueggemann writes about this. Faith is not a matter of intellectual content or cognitive belief. It is rather a matter of quite practical reliance upon the assurance of God in a context of risk where one's own resources are not adequate. It means to entrust one's security and future to the attentiveness of Jehovah, to count God's attentiveness as adequate and sure, thereby making panic, anxiety, or foolishness unnecessary and inappropriate. It is to know oneself safe in risk because of an attending other whose resources are mobilized and whose commitments are unfailing. It is to place oneself into the reliable care of another. That's exactly what Ahaz is being invited to do. Down there in verse 4, one of the first statements that we read, when Isaiah first begins talking to him, take heed and be quiet. This has variously been translated. Again, kind of the wording differs depending on which version you might be reading from. Yours might say, be careful to do nothing. Is that not a statement of tremendous faith that you must have in another to say, I'm going to do nothing? Obviously, you got to give all the standard caveats of saying, okay, but we have to do something in this life. But that really isn't the point for right now to observe. What God was trying to tell Ahaz is simply that. Sit tight. Don't try to figure it out yourself. Trust in me. Be careful to do nothing. Be content. Be quiet. Take heed and do nothing. The only thing you need to do is not worry about this and trust that Jehovah will deal with the problem. In this time of extreme and real distress, this isn't a fiction. This isn't a cakewalk that Ahaz is put through. They're facing real difficulty. I don't know how bad things had gotten when they were besieging the city, but they're actually facing trouble right now. So now the king is called to actively, publicly trust in God rather than any other source. Don't panic. Don't do anything foolish. Don't start mustering the troops, going to foreign nations for help, etc. The threat is real, but God has told him that he will overcome it. Now, the question, will Ahaz act accordingly? Let's continue on reading in verse number 10. Moreover, the Lord spoke again to Ahaz, saying, "Ask a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. Ask it either in the depth or in the height above." Now Jehovah shows his willingness to go above and beyond in inviting the trust of Ahaz. He was apparently unconvinced after Isaiah's initial ministry to him, so God offers a virtual carte blanche. You name the sign over what might be shown. You've got total control. Even saying there in verse 11, either in the depth or in the height above, you name it. How many people in history have asked for this same thing with God? From motives either, sincere or sinful, just give me a sign, God. Maybe it's over something, a normal life decision that you want to know what is the right path forward. I want to know what's right to do. God, should I take this job and move across country? I've got two minds about it. I'm not really sure. If you could just impart the knowledge into me directly or show me a sign so that I'll know this is the right thing to do. Should I marry this person I've been dating for a while? I want to know if this is the right thing to do. I know nothing's guaranteed in life. If you could tell me, send me some kind of sign, write it in letters of fire in the sky so that I will know I'm doing the right thing here. Or in spiritual matters, you've asked God, just tell me what's the right thing to do. Or maybe help this other person. I think of this in connection with that rich man who died alongside Lazarus in the story that Jesus told. Of a rich man who had been sinful during his life, and he's now experiencing torment and the punishment that came about at his death. And he asked Abraham, can't I just go back or send somebody back to go talk to my brothers so that they know they need to clean up their act before they join me here? Let me go to them and tell them that this judgment stuff is real and they need to live right. Haven't we wanted those who we love in our lives, those who are precious to us, to have some kind of sign that would show them that God has meant what he has said, that God is serious, that we need to follow him right now, that there is judgment coming and that they must be attentive to that. Give them some kind of sign. Prove to them irrevocably, make it firm in their minds that the time is now for them to trust, to obey God, to do what he has told us to do. Just give them proof they can't deny. We want assurance from God. Again, I don't know how many billions of people who have lived in the history of man who have wanted this exact same thing. And we come to the same conclusion at the end, kind of after making that plea. I would be at peace if I knew for sure. If you gave me the sign, I would be able to have peace and contentment and joy and faith in you if we just had a sign. And God is telling Ahaz, you name it. But Ahaz refuses. In verse 12, Ahaz said, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord. That sounds pious. And we might be tempted on first reading to say that's the right call. Even laudable. I mean, that's even kind of impressive on his part, right? Because you read about Israel during the time of Moses especially, he says they tested the Lord. They wanted him him to give them some kind of sign. And always were speaking big words about what they'd do if they just had some kind of proof, or if he did great things for them in the wilderness. That's why they would believe. You think of the people in the time of Jesus. He calls them a wicked generation. They asked for a sign. That's what they kept saying. We'll believe you're the Christ if you give us the proof. And the people in all those cases were judged for that kind of unbelief. And so maybe we'd find Ahaz saying here, oh, no, I won't do that. What a good guy. But Ahaz wasn't actually concerned about testing God. He's not refusing for righteous reasons. This seems to be more a case of not wanting to have faith. Why not? Why doesn't Ahaz want a sign? Because a true sign obligates one to believe. It creates an obligation to believe. The jury, who is shown indisputable proof during the trial, they see the video of the accused committing the crime, and there are no mitigating circumstances, there are no excuses to be offered. They have ironclad, concrete proof. They have no choice but to convict. They've been placed into an obligation to make a decision to believe that that is right. There's the sign. There's the proof. We have to. When we say to someone, oh yeah, well, prove it, and they prove it, well then, there are no more arguments. You say to me, I can dunk a basketball today. And I go, no, you can't. And we get out on the basketball court and you throw down a tomahawk jam. Well, then I just kind of sit there saying, okay, you were right. I've got to believe you now if you tell me that same thing in the future. Ahaz is being given this chance. If you want a sign, if you want to believe me, I can give you something that will leave no doubt. But the problem is Ahaz is essentially saying to God, I don't want to believe you. I don't want to have faith. Because Ahaz has something different in mind. Keep your finger in Isaiah chapter 7, but turn with me please to 2 Kings chapter 16. We'll shed light on what is actually going on. 2 Kings chapter 16. Let's begin our reading in verse 7. This is all happening essentially during this same time. 2 Kings chapter 16 has been telling us about Syria and Israel coming to try to make war against Judah. 2 Kings 16, verse 7. So Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am your servant and your son. Come up and save me from the hand of the king of Syria and from the hand of the king of Israel, who rise up against me. And Ahaz took the silver and gold that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house, and sent it as a present to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria heeded him, for the king of Assyria went up against Damascus and took it, carried its people captive to Kir, and killed Rezin. God has told Ahaz, be quiet and do nothing. I will handle this. Simply believe me. And if you want a sign to prove that, I'll give you one. And Ahaz has responded by saying, I don't want a sign. I'll handle this on my own. Or really, I'll go find a tougher friend who will be able to handle this on his own. He goes to the king of Assyria. The problem here, in its most basic terms, the king thinks that he has an alternative means of salvation. He wants deliverance, but he doesn't want it from God. Sure, God's way might work. But then he'd have to do things God's way. And he's not ready to do that. Better to do it without Jehovah, if there are options available. The king who has wearied men with his less than stellar reign already, now was wearying God with unbelief. Continuing in verse 13 of the passage, then he said, and this seems to be talking about Isaiah, maybe God himself or Isaiah speaking for God. Hear now, O house of David, is it a small thing for you to weary men, but will you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Curds and honey he shall eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that you dread will be forsaken by both her kings. Notice in verse 11 and verse 13 a change that takes place. When Isaiah is making the offer to Ahaz, he says, ask a sign of Jehovah your God. And now after Ahaz refuses that, Isaiah calls him my God. He's no God of Ahaz because Ahaz has chosen something completely different. Having rejected a sign that would establish him through God's promises, Ahaz receives instead a sign that would portend very different things. I don't believe this sign that he's talking about, well, okay, so you've declined, but I'll give you one anyway, God is saying. This is not simply him giving a positive promise to Ahaz despite unbelief. It's an expression of his displeasure. Yes, this child to be born soon, whoever it is, and explanations of a first literal physical fulfillment of the prophecy. They each have their own problems. To be honest, we won't look at all of those this morning. A lot of candidates are offered. I think it might be referring to Isaiah's wife, that this is another child that would be born to Isaiah. In chapter 8, the prophet will refer to the sons that have been given to him that were kind of symbols of certain things, the children that God had given to him. Maybe this is another one of those. Whoever it is, though, and whatever is being discussed, the point is this, that this child who's about to be born, that will be called Emmanuel, he won't have learned to tell right from wrong yet before your enemies, King Ahaz, are overthrown. However long that would take, probably would depend on what you mean by a child who can tell right from wrong. And there is the idea in that of sort of being able to tell something that is sweet from something that is not, maybe from something that is bitter. That happens pretty quickly. We offer a lot of things to Malcolm already. He's just over a year old, and there's a lot of things that get this reaction. And no, I don't want that. I don't want to eat that. And there's a lot of stuff that gets this reaction. Yes, I want that. Give me more of those. Malcolm asks us a bunch. Before he can even talk, he says, I want that, and I don't want that. But if you're talking about actually knowing what you're doing and what's right and what's wrong, even still, that's not going to be long into adulthood when you can figure that out. So before this child that's about to be born very soon knows good from bad, he says, this whole thing, King Ahaz, will have blown over. Well, that is good. But what else will happen with this child? That reference to eating curds and honey, another kind of enigmatic statement. I believe it is a sign of poverty that he is talking about. He'll use that expression later on in the judgment section, beginning in verse 22, really, 21 and 22, when he's giving these 4 oracles of judgment against Judah. That's one of them, that the people would be eating curds and honey. That seems to be indicating that normal staples wouldn't be available. The things you get from cultivated land, when society is operating as it should, when the land is filled with people, when they're growing vines, when they're growing grain, when they're sitting under their trees, all those sorts of things, then you have wheat, and you have bread, and you have wine, and you have olive oil, and you have figs, and you have all those kinds of things. But after this destruction comes, you eat what you can get from an animal and nothing more. Nothing's cultivated, nothing's reliable. If you come across a beehive, try and scoop some honey out. If you've got an animal, a cow that stayed alive, get some of that, some curds from that, get some of that coagulated milk and eat that. But that's all you can rely on. This child would inherit poverty as well because of Ahaz's refusal to have faith in Jehovah. And I think verses 17 through 25, the true intention of that sign becomes clear with the continuing prophecy. Look at verse 17. We won't read the rest of the chapter except for verse 17. Jehovah will bring the king of Assyria upon you and your people in your father's house, days that have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah. You didn't want the sign. You refused to place your faith in me. So this one that you're going to instead to solve your problems, the king of Assyria, he's going to turn on you and prove to be your worst nightmare. He's going to ravage and spoil the land, even though you counted on him for salvation. Concluding the point of the chapter then, it begins with a crisis, a real one, a dire one. Local enemies are invading. The nation is at risk. God issues a decree. That invasion would fail. He offers Ahaz to put his trust in Jehovah. And that's the turning point. Because the king says politely, no thank you. And so the chapter ends with prediction of an even greater crisis. Faraway enemies would not only threaten Judah, they will ruin it. What is the point for us? We find ourselves in the same position as Ahaz. Application could be made to the various times of trial and difficulty that we might face in this life. I don't think that would be inappropriate. Times where we, just like Ahaz and his people were described at the beginning, we're shaking like leaves on a tree in the wind. Whatever it might be that's causing that. An illness, a diagnosis. Financial trouble, uncertainty, difficulty within a marriage, difficulty with our children, difficulty with our parents, difficulty with our church, uncertain social values and circumstances. Whatever it is that is causing the fear, the answer and the way forward is always the same for people of any wisdom whatsoever. Do not fear. Take heed and be quiet. Trust in me. More pointedly, though, I think, there is a trouble that is common to man, a crisis born of our own foolishness and our own rebellion. We stand guilty before God. We stand deserving of death because of our sin. And yet God's appeal to us is going to be essentially the same as that made to Ahaz. I will handle the problem. Do not fear. Be calm. Believe and be established by my word and my promise. Salvation will come through me. Have faith in that. Verse 4. Take heed and be quiet. Do not fear or be faint-hearted. The situation is under God's control. Our circumstance differs, of course, in that we are not given a choice in the sign, because it simply has already been given in verse 14. A child born, Emmanuel. Matthew in chapter 1 of his gospel will apply this prophecy. This honestly rather cryptic statement will be applied to the birth of Jesus and given new light, given new meaning through what he accomplishes and who he is. But it is the Lord himself who gave a sign. The virgin conceived and bore a son, and his name shall be called Emmanuel, a name or a term which means God is with us. And in the truest, most literal, and greatest sense, this would be a child who was God with us. The Son of God and the Son of Man. Divinity, deity, dwelling in human form as we live as men. Christ, a king, born with kingly blood, but with no crown, no throne, no land. There is the sign that was given for men. Jesus himself. Well, how and why would we have faith today? Because we have that clear testimony of Jesus Christ. Born of a virgin, sinless in life, revealed as the Son of God in his death, victor over sin through his resurrection, now enthroned and given all authority at the right hand of God, where he stands interceding on our behalf as our priest and our king. Will we save ourselves some other way? Will we, like Ahaz, look elsewhere and say, "Thank you, God, but no thanks. I will figure it out"? We refuse this sign. We refuse faith because we believe there is an alternative. If so, if that is your plan, you will fail and you will fall. If you will not believe, surely you shall not be established, was the prophecy in verse 9. It rings true today of the same offer that God has made. If you do not believe, you will not be established. If you do not have faith, you will not stand, because there is salvation in no other. I make those statements kindly, not as an insult to say to someone, "You will fail through any other means." But in the truest sense, we can make that statement motivated by pure love for a person and by pure love for your soul to tell you, you will fail if you try to be saved outside of Christ, because it cannot happen. And so you must appeal to him. You must come to him with faith so that you can stand in the day of judgment. Our prayer this morning is that